When the Upsetter met the Wailers in the summer of 1970, it proved to be a combination of elements that would cause a creative chemical reaction that would profoundly alter the course of both their careers. Stay tuned for part 4 of my look at the late, great Lee Scratch Perry. At the dawn of the 1970s, Lee Perry was riding high on the success of his spaghetti western-themed instrumentals, which were doing well in the UK market, particularly Return of Django, which had reached number 5 in the UK charts and prompted not only an LP named after it, but a tour of England, which occurred over the winter of 1969 going into 1970. The band Perry brought with him on that tour was not the one that had played on the record, but a younger, up-and-coming group of session players he was beginning to work with called the Hippie Boys. Seen here, the Hippie Boys were a band consisting of Glenn Adams on organ, Alva Reggie Lewis on guitar, and a young bass and drum duo, two brothers by the names of Aston, nicknamed Family Man, Barrett on bass, and his brother Carlton on drums. This band would embark on a tour of the UK going into 1970, seen here with Lee Perry right there with the briefcase, arriving in England. Lee Perry would then begin releasing a flood of material, again focusing on the instrumentals which were doing so well for him in the UK market. Following on from his debut, The Upsetter, released in 1969, there would soon be several albums of Lee Perry material on the market, most from here on credited to The Upsetters, the band, with himself as producers. There would be Clint Eastwood and Eastwood Rides Again, all these spaghetti western themed, largely instrumentals, plus a select group of vocalists he was working with. Each album would have a couple of vocals on it, but be predominantly instrumental. Eastwood Rides Again here, seen there, with Return of Django, the Dr. Bird CD edition. 1970 would see Many Moods of the Upsetter, as well as Scratch, the Upsetter again appear on the market in Dr. Bird CD issue with the Upsetter. In 1970, however, Lee Perry was approached by an old acquaintance from his Studio One days, a singer by the name of Robert Nesta Marley, who was the leader of the Wailers. The Wailing Wailers, as they were originally called, had arrived at Studio One in the early 1960s, shortly after Lee Perry. They had worked side by side together, so they had known each other for years. The Wailers had left Studio One around the same time as Lee Perry for much the same reasons, trying to get better pay, better control of their material, their recordings, better working conditions, where Lee Perry had initially struggled and was now finding some solid success, particularly in the UK. The Wailers had been going through a number of hurdles, a number of setbacks. In the late 1960s, Bob had spent some periods in the United States, in Delaware, working. Bunny Wailer had been jailed for more than a year for ganja possession, and the band had suffered through a number of setbacks. They were recording strong material, but failing to find the breakthrough they were looking for. They had signed with a label called Jad, run by American soul singer Johnny Nash, with Arthur Jenkins and Danny Sims. Jad had recorded a number of Wailers material, enthused by Bob's promise as a songwriter, but not much had surfaced to that point. They had worked with Leslie Kong's Beverly's label, resulting in the ill-fated Best of the Wailers LP. Leslie Kong died suddenly shortly after. So the Wailers were at loose ends, looking for a musical lifeline to keep the band going. They had started their own label, Wailin' Soul M, wasn't generating enough revenue, so they were very much at loose ends with members coming and going. When Bob Marley had heard of the Hippie Boys rhythm section, he had no doubt noted the success of the Return of Django single, sought out the Hippie Boys rhythm section to work on a song that they self-produced called Black Progress. This would be the first collaboration of the Wailers with the Hippie Boys and the rhythm section of the Barrett Brothers. This would be a combination which would spark a catalyst of change in the Wailers, lead to an intense period of growth, especially once the Hippie Boys led them to Lee Perry, who the Hippie Boys were increasingly working with as Lee Perry groomed them into his next generation of upsetters, you might say. Bob Marley soon approached Lee Perry himself, reportedly met him at his Upsetter record shop, played some of his recent songs. Lee Perry was not really enthused about working with more singers at this point. He was having solid success with these instrumentals. He was working very much on inspiration in the studio. He would get very excited when the elements in place, the creative juices were flowing and things were happening, perhaps resulting in a hit song, but he would get frustrated when things weren't working quite right, the elements weren't there, and that would tend to happen a lot with the vocalists. So he was definitely concentrating on instrumentals. However, he was struck by something in the songs Bob Marley played for him, particularly one called My Cup, adapted from a James Brown song that Lee Perry loved, where Bob Marley sang, "My cup is overflowing and I don't know what to do." Lee Perry was taken by the honesty, the sincerity in Bob's delivery in those words. There was another called Cornerstone, which says, "The stone that the builder refused shall always be the head cornerstone." Lyrics lifted from the Bible, but they reflected a growing sense of spirituality in Bob. All three of the Wailers, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Wailer, by now committed Rastafarians who had accepted Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie as Jah Rastafari, the returned Messiah for the black race, the African race, as well as being informed by the civil rights movement in the UK, or in the US rather, by American soul music, by the notion of black power. These themes, this growing sense of political consciousness, spiritual consciousness, all growing in the Wailers. Lee Perry was moved to begin working with Bob Marley. Soon moved Bob into his own home. Earlier at Studio One, Cox and Dodd had let Bob Marley live for a time in a back room in the studio. Lee Perry brought Bob Marley into his own home, let him stay in a room as the two began collaborating on material. Their collaboration would be short, relatively, stretching over several months from the middle part of 1970 going into 1971, but it would be a transformative period for both of them that would result in some of the strongest material either of them ever recorded. Collaboration between Lee Perry and Bob Marley and the Wailers proved to be an inspired one, as together they created a body of work many regard as the finest either of them ever did, recording a little over 2 LPs worth of sides over several months going into early 1971, working with the Hippie Boys rhythm section at Randy's studio with sessions engineered by the great Errol Thompson. This period of Bob Marley's career, by the way, shortly before signing to Island Records, was extensively heavily covered by Johnny Nash's Jad Records on several CD box sets released in the late 1990s. These are my original copies from them. The Complete Wailers 1967 to 1972 series, 3 CD box set on Volume 1 and Volume 2. These include not only the sessions recorded for Johnny Nash's Jad Records, but self-productions, work for Leslie Kong's Beverly's label, as well as the Lee Perry sessions right in the middle. Volume 3 is 2 discs. That is the only one which I have on vinyl. And these include the Lee Perry material, along with many unreleased alternate takes. They would begin recording a series of songs that would be essential parts of Bob Marley and the Wailers canon, reveal the 3 main singers and songwriters, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Wailer, as the strong individual voices they were growing into, with increasing sense of social, political, and spiritual awareness that was developing in each of them through their growing consciousness of Rastafari. Rastafari was exploding in Jamaica at this time, following on from the official visit in 1966 of Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. Had previously been very looked down on by the authorities, still was not quite kosher to come out and openly talk about Rastafari themes on record. Lee Perry, however, growing increasingly sympathetic to many of the messages in Rastafari. In 1969, he had recorded U-Roy, doing a very strongly Rastafarian-themed song called Rightful Ruler, with musical input by Peter Tosh himself, before going on to collaborate more fully with the group, the Wailers, the next year. These sessions would result in some of the finest songs of Bob Marley and the Wailers' career, would finally be released in 1970 as the Soul Rebels LP, handled by Trojan Records in the UK, with the iconic cover. This fused American-style rhythm and blues with a pared-down sound. The Hippie Boys rhythm section, aka the Upsetters, peeling back the layers of excess that had been piled on the Wailers to reveal the true essence that they were developing into, the essence of 3 powerful individuals that they were developing into. Lean, sinuous, stripped down, pared down rhythm tracks. Lee Perry, a few years later, likened the musical tracks, the rhythms, to the sound of a gun being pointed. That was the militant feel he was going for. Suitably, the militant guerrilla image of the cover, Soul Rebels, classic LP, not the debut LP by Bob Marley and the Wailers, but maybe their finest album-length statement to date. Most mature album recorded as an LP, conceived as an LP, includes some of their finest songs, updating some of their earlier songs from the 1960s at Studio One, some new songs, as well as some that would later be revised, updated later on for major label Island Records. Soul Rebels LP was reissued a few years later by Trojan Records as Rasta Revolution, with one substitution. Duppy Conqueror, not present on the original LP, but appended to this version of it. Trojan Records. This appeared in 1974. Rasta Revolution, basically the Soul Rebels album, much more affordable. Includes Mr. Brown, a somewhat comical tale which was going around Jamaica at that time, of a crow that was seen riding around on a coffin, somewhat supernatural tale, whimsical if you will. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown is a clown that rides around on a coffin. Includes the title track itself, Soul Rebel. This had earlier been done in a different version for Johnny Nash's Jad Records with string sections and kind of doo-wop harmonies, but this version for Lee Perry was an entirely different beast with a menacing, stripped back bass line and very reflective, very spiritual performance by Bob Marley. I'm a living man, I've got works to do, he says on that song. As well, you get Try Me and My Cup itself, which had so struck Lee Perry. Cornerstone, the stone that the builder refused, shall always be the Ked cornerstone. The Wailers expressing their Rastafarian faith. Soul Almighty, Bob aiming straight at the American R&B market. As well, Peter Tosh contributed some of the songs that he is most associated with. 400 Years, which would later reappear on the Catch a Fire LP, credited to the Wailers, released by Island Records, as well as No Sympathy, which would appear on his Legalize It album. Duppy Conqueror, the song, ostensibly supernatural in nature. A duppy in Jamaica is a malevolent spirit which can cause harm to the living. Here, it's more of an expression of the Wailers fending off evil forces. As they say, the bars could not hold I, force could not control I. I've got to reach Mount Zion, again expressing their faith in Jah Rastafari. The album would be released in the UK, register solidly, and increase the profile of the Wailers internationally. Most iconic songs to come out of the Lee Perry and the Wailers collaboration was Small Axe. Its lyrics inspired by Lee Perry's view of the three major recording studios in Jamaica, Federal, Dynamic, and Cox and Dodd's Studio One, holding hegemony over smaller producers like himself with their control over the recording industry, the means of production, and its lyrics of, if you are a big tree, we are the small axe, sharpened to cut you down, perfectly expressed by the Wailers, resonating with the Wailers' struggles against the forces that had been arrayed against them, and also resonated with the listeners as reggae took on an increasingly militant tone, increasingly identifying with the sufferers, the poor, those victimized, marginalized. The beat of the Upsetters, the Hippie Boys rhythm section, somewhat changing the direction of reggae music at this time, becoming harder, more militant, the more cutting-edge, rugged rhythm sections, particularly of the Barrett brothers. The partnership would not be without its tensions. Bunny Wailer and Peter Tosh reportedly becoming resentful of Lee Perry's close working relationship with Bob Marley in this time. Lee Perry was also having disputes with the Hippie Boys, aka the Upsetters band, would try out another young up-and-coming session band on a couple of occasions, the Soul Syndicate. There were disputes over finances, over money, so tensions growing. The collaboration, while extremely creatively productive, was not entirely stable, would not hold together indefinitely, but resulted in an incredible, if compact, body of work for both parties, for all parties concerned. A second LP of Bob Marley and the Wailers material for Lee Perry, incredibly, was turned down for release in the UK by Trojan Records. Lee Perry would have to release it himself in Jamaica as Soul Revolution Part 2. Again, cover images of the Wailers posing with toy guns, playing with this militant image, but inside, again, some of the strongest material the band ever did. This album would be belatedly released by Trojan Records with an altered track listing as African Herbsman, the title track, an adaptation of a Richie Havens song, which Bob Marley infuses with a Black consciousness, a Rastafarian consciousness. Trojan Records. This would include Small Axe, Lively Up Yourself, of course, later done on the Island Records. Keep On Moving, again, done later on in a later version. All in One, a medley. Put It On, one of the band's early hits at Studio One. Sun is Shining, another signature song of the Lee Perry years with its menacing, stripped down, aggressive bass line. And Riding High, again, some fine performances from the group put on wax. Lee Perry would then take the unprecedented step of releasing an all-instrumental LP of the version sides of all of those songs from Soul Revolution Part 2. It would appear as a rhythm album. This was an unprecedented step at this point in Jamaica. Was not a dub album per se, but it was instrumental versions of all the tracks with the vocals removed and without any further dub techniques added to it. Dub, just around the corner, not quite invented yet. Lee Perry definitely ahead of the curve at this point. But both those albums released in Jamaica, very, very collectible nowadays. All that material, again, is on those complete Wailers CD box sets. By 1971, however, other commitments called Bob Marley away from Jamaica. He had to go to Sweden to work with Johnny Nash on a film soundtrack project which did not fare well. Bunny Wailer and Peter Tosh would continue working with Lee Perry on an occasional basis in Jamaica. But by 1971, the partnership between the parties, between Lee Perry and the Wailers, was no more. The Wailers would get Lee Perry to engineer one of their self-productions, Lick Samba. That would be their final efforts together as a group. The next song the band did was called Trenchtown Rock, entirely self-produced. That is included on the African Herbsman LP. Trenchtown Rock, one of their most strident statements to date, which showed them fully arriving as a group in control of their own destiny, perhaps owing something to the influence Lee Perry had had on them, but it was entirely self-produced, would reportedly be #1 in Jamaica for 5 months, one of the band's biggest successes to that point, and would set them on the road that would later send them to Island Records and international stardom. Lee Perry, meanwhile, would continue in another direction, but neither Bob Marley and the Wailers and Lee Perry would ever be quite the same after this relatively brief yet meaningful collaboration between the two of them. Bob Marley, for his part, would come back to Lee Perry on occasion, most notably on the Punky Reggae Party single several years later, but Bunny Wailer and Peter Tosh reportedly glad to hit the road, leave Lee Perry behind them in pursuit of their musical futures. This has been Chapter 4 of my look at Lee Perry. Stay tuned for Chapter 5 as Lee Perry enters what many consider some of his greatest period to date.